Howdy, friends, and welcome. It is great to have you today to continue our conversation. A lot of us have been chatting about recently with our own friends, our families, our communities, and in our storyteller. If you're a journalist or a meteorologist or a content creator, it's all today is going to be around the costs and the impacts of climate change, and then also the costs that were kind of occurring as we start to see more energy demand being asked by our communities, our states, for many different reasons. So specifically, we want to know two things. One, we want to know how climate change is impacting both the demand of electricity and how that's showing up on our electricity bill. And then for a little extra behind the curtain view of this topic in terms of that price tag that lands in your mailbox, we're joined today by PowerLines, a national energy consumer education nonprofit who's going to help us go through all of that. My name is Shel Winkley. I'm the Senior Engagement Specialist and Chief Meteorologist here at Climate Central. For some of those who may be new to one of our webinars or haven't joined us before, Climate Central is a nonprofit, non-advocacy organization dedicated to researching and reporting about our changing climate. Here at Climate Central, what we do is we develop and we distribute broadcast and content publish-ready climate and data for your storytelling and your communication. Everything that you see, all the resources that you see here today will be available to you, and including the cooling degree days, graphics that you'll see, those are already on our website right now. This briefing is being recorded and a recording will be emailed to everyone after the call. As a reminder, any resources again presented today are free and available. You can share them with your colleagues, your friends, your family, and especially on social media. And everything that is being presented today is also on the records. After the presentations, we'll open up for questions and answers for maybe what's on your mind. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a Q&A feature. Go ahead and put those questions there, and we will get those before the hour is over. Okay, so as our planet warms, hotter, more intense temperatures, and more frequent extreme heat increases the cooling demand to keep our homes, schools, and other places we walk in and out of during the day safe and comfortable. So this morning, Climate Central released a new analysis to understand how this warming from human-caused heat-trapping pollution is impacting your thermostat and your wallet. For example, in the U.S., projected changes in what is called these cooling degree days is simply, the days that we need to crank the AC are expected to drive a 43% increase in household cooling demand by the year 2050. That, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration's latest outlook. And again, that's just what households need to stay cool. Meanwhile, more than 2 in 3 consumers reported their electric or gas bill has increased just this year alone, and more than 3 in 4 are worried that their bills will continue to rise. That's according to PowerLines Ipsos poll from earlier this year. People aren't imagining higher bills. Utility companies are continuing to ask to raise energy prices. In the last quarter, utilities companies requested $9.2 billion in rate increases that could affect more than 56 million customers. That brings the total rate increase requests to 18.6 billion for 2026, according to the latest PowerLines reports. So let's get into that. I want to introduce you to the great minds and the great panelists that you will hear from today. First, we'll hear from Jen Brady, Senior Data Analyst and Research Manager here at Climate Central. We'll be joined by Tracy Wolf, a media expert and content producer in the environment and energy space. You may know Tracy's previous work through CBS News, ABC News, ESPN, National Geographic, PBS NewsHour Weekend, and the Dan Rathers Report. And then we'll also have a great conversation in just a bit with Tremaine Phillips, a former Michigan Public Service Commissioner and Senior Advisor at PowerLines. Again, after the presentation, we're going to open up for questions, so please use that Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Okay, before we get started, though, I do want to show you where we're going to see some of this heat over the next few days, why we're going to need our air conditioning. So we've already experienced quite a few heat waves across the United States. What you're looking at here, this is Climate Central's Climate Shift Index. Essentially, this is our tool to be able to show you where not only are you feeling unusual heat when you walk out the door, but where is there a fingerprint of our warming climate on it as well. And so the darker colors you see today across the Four Corners region, into the desert Southwest, Texas, and a bit up into the Northeast, this is where we understand that there's an overlap between the temperatures we're feeling and where climate change has made it more likely. This is today. This is your Thursday, and you can see as we go into the weekend, we're really starting to see this fingerprint show up more. In fact, on Friday alone, 150.8 million people will experience heat that was made at least 2 times more likely, even here at the beginning of August, due to human caused climate change. And those darker colors you see from California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, and then even up into the Northeast, that's a climate shift index of 5. 33.1 million people are forecast to feel that climate shift index of 5, top of the scale, which essentially tells us that those are temperatures that would have been almost virtually impossible without a fingerprint of climate change here in August. So, with that kind of setting the stage, Jen, let's start with you. Tracy Tremaine, you can hang out for just a bit if you would. So, Jen, just really simply kick it off because I've already had this question a lot today. Can you just tell us what the heck a cooling degree day means in the most simplest form that you can?
Well, let me start with the simplest thing is it's not a day. So we can dismiss that, which makes it a little confusing. But basically, a cooling degree day is a measure of how much the temperature is above the average temperature every day. And it was originally established actually in some research and historical record says in the 1930s by building engineers to figure out how much you had to heat and cool a space. So it's been around for a long time. And maybe that's why that's such a bad name. But that's what a cooling degree day is. And I'll get a little deeper into the definition and kind of the math, which is actually pretty straightforward in my presentation.
So I was trying to do a little bit of the math, and I know you'll get into this in your presentation, so I don't want to give away too much. But my average temperature here in central southeast Texas yesterday was 87 degrees. It
Mhm.
was gross. I could test. It was not fun. So my cooling degree day number then would be 87 minus 65, right? And so
Correct.
that's my number. And then
12.
that we can look at over, let's say, a month or a season to understand how much cooling generally is needed for a place or no.
Basically, yeah, that's what you're looking at because the assumption is that 65 is kind of the temperature we want to live at in a building, and so that's why they set that. There actually is because it is such a simple mathematical formula, you can change that. So you can do what's called the base, and the base is usually 65. You can make the base 70, or if you really like it chilly, you can make the base 55. But usually when you see it, if it's not otherwise designated, it means the base we're looking at around 65 because that's what we think, kind of a building temperature should be and to keep us comfortable during the day. So, but good job on the math. And yeah, we'll go into that a little more.
Yeah, that's only after one cup of coffee. Okay, I'll let you take it away.
Okay. We now I'm so confused by math. Let me see if I can share my screen properly. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to give you some overall really high level trends, where we're going, kind of to build on what Shell told you about the temperatures this week. I'm going to talk to you about what's been happening over like the last 50 plus years. So the trends in cooling demand. Um, and why is this important as well? Because we are seeing an overall increased electricity demand. There is a movement for a lot of good reasons to electrify our world, to decarbonize. And so that talks means electric vehicles, means moving to heat pumps, all your utilities, and induction stove, maybe. We also know things like data centers, new businesses that are popping up are using a lot of power, in addition to increased AC use, which is what we're going to focus on more today. But we know there's going to be increased electricity demand across the board. This is from the NCA 5, which is the National Climate Assessment Report that the US did, and how much more electricity we are going to need in the next, really the near future. So this is with a high emission scenario. Some of this has changed a little bit, but I think we can kind of say relatively so. What we're seeing is, at least a doubling of our need for electricity. And a lot of this electricity demand is driven by heating and cooling, and it's not just all those other things that we're looking at. So this is all very much in the realm of what we're experiencing this summer, and unfortunately now we're experiencing in the spring and fall as well, the need for cooling. One little light spot is maybe we can use renewables to handle some of this load. We are seeing, this is a Climate Matters release from earlier this year. We are seeing an increase in solar and wind power this is across the country. So this can hopefully help handle some of that load of the additional electricity that we are going to need and maybe moderate the costs as well. Because one graphic I didn't include here is the costs of wind and solar are also going down. So that's really beneficial to the overall equation. Last thing, kind of as an overview here, why does it matter? Because there's a lot of health risks in addition to just our discomfort. Being in hot weather is one of the biggest killers in the US. It's often overlooked. It's not quite as dramatic as, say, a tornado or a hurricane. So oftentimes we don't realize how many people are dying because of heat. Fortunately, I think the awareness is going up a little, which is good. And we do have things like heat centers and other heat emergencies that hopefully people are paying attention to. But that's why it matters that we need this cooling. The other thing is, if we have power outages, for example, because we're demanding too much power, medical equipment will go out. We have people using generators in the wrong way. Hopefully, you're not doing that inside. And then just the mental health impacts of the continued heat and your body kind of breaking down over time. We also find this when the doesn't cool down overnight, which is another thing we're not going to go into here, but we'll find that the cooling is not, so you can't shut off your air conditioner overnight anymore like maybe you used to. So now the math. Cooling degree day. Like I said, first thing is unfortunately put out of your mind that it's a day. Um, it's really just the difference between the average temperature every day and 65 degrees. And again, like I said, this was originally set up as an engineering measurement to figure out when you're putting in a building how much cooling capacity you need in that building. There is a I guess, opposite measure you would see is the heating degree days, which is kind of the opposite, how much heating you need to put in place. But we're going to focus on cooling degree days now. So as Shell did with his very impressive math skills, it is the difference between 65 degrees. So I used an even easier number than he did. The CDD on a 75 degree days is 10. And so say every day of the year was 75 degrees, which would be, I just realized would be really delightful. If every day of the year was 75 degrees, the annual CDD would be 3,650, right? Because it would be 365 times 10. So that's kind of the basic math of cooling degree days. It is hard a lot of times to look at the numbers, and we'll see some of those and kind of conceptualize those. So a lot of times what we look at is how much has it changed over time, the percentage change, because it is hard to just say, if someone just said, oh gosh, did you know in Cincinnati, the cooling degree days were 3,000 last year? It's really not something that you can usually grasp onto very easily. So like Shel said, today on Climate Matters, we released some new visuals about the rising cooling demand across the country. So what I'm going to highlight here is, first of all, I'm going to talk about a few cities that we assume are going to be hot. We assume there's a cooling demand, but we're still seeing an increase in those cities. New Orleans, for example, during this period from 1970 to 2025, you can see it baselined around 2,500 is where we're starting, and kind of keep that in mind for the other cities we see. And the average temperature in New Orleans in this period has been between 67 and 71 degrees or so. That's kind of the trend in temperature. So when you're looking at, which makes sense with when we were talking about a 10-degree change, we're looking at around 3,600 here. Again, another high demand city, traditionally a hot city that we think of is Miami. But also notice that even these cities, we're seeing an increase in demand. New Orleans, the baseline was at around 2,500 it started and went up. Miami starts at around 4,000 and goes up, so a little higher. And that's partially reflected in their average temperature. The average temperature range in Miami during this period was 74 to 77. So about 10 degrees higher than we saw the average temperature range in New Orleans. So not surprising, we're seeing a higher CDD cooling degree days. So now I think we're going to talk about a couple cities, and this is the sort of thing I think where a lot of the focus is going now, are these locations where previously maybe people didn't even have air conditioning. It's not even that they're turning it on more. It's that they don't even have an air conditioning in their home because they didn't need it before. Now, remember the baseline for New Orleans and Miami started at around 2000, 4,000. Seattle started at 100. So you can see how much lower the cooling demand used to be in Seattle. And it's still much lower even today. It's still only going up to 4 or 500. But again, also you can see the increase has been 160% increase, which means probably a lot of people who did not have air conditioning before now feel they need air conditioning. Either they're just uncomfortable, they have health conditions. So this is, to me, what we're hearing a lot about are these locations that are now moving into a cooling situation that weren't in before. And I'm just going to feature one more city quickly, and that's Boise. Again, kind of a traditionally, maybe it wasn't so warm, a little higher than Seattle. It started around 600, but again, almost 100% increase over this period. The Seattle average temperatures were between 50 and 54, the Boise between 50 and 53. So similar average temperatures. What probably is pushing Boise a little higher is maybe they're peaking out higher in the summer, and so they're getting some higher averages in the summertime, where Seattle is more constant throughout the year. But again, these were where a lot of the conversation is, because the power bills maybe weren't dependent on air conditioning and cooling before, but now they are. So I think that's all I have to give you a quick overview. And happy to answer any general questions about cooling degree days later. So thanks, Shel.
Thanks for one, those numbers. Thinking about Boise specifically, I had an opportunity to go there a couple years ago. And one thing that I thought was really interesting flying in, it's pretty flat. And then I remember leaving the airport and it said, I think it's like the city of trees. I'm probably not getting that right. So apologies to anybody in Boise. But the idea is like the city of like a lot of trees. I was like, I didn't see a single tree flying in. And then you go and there are so many trees there. So like this is even going beyond just urban development, urban heat island effect. Like yes, that is maybe part of it, but we understand that Boise is one of our fastest warming cities in America for a lot of our seasons as well. So it just kind of shows that added heat as well. So
Yeah, and it's a whole tradition of lifestyle in a lot of ways. Because in Miami and New Orleans, you realize you live in a hot place, but some of these other cities, you don't move to Seattle for the heat, and but now you're experiencing it a lot more.
yeah. All right, Jen, appreciate you. Well, let's take a break for just a second and we will move on with our conversation. I want to bring in, Tracy Wolf. So, what Jen just told us, that's how our changing climate, the weather that we have inherited, is driving up the need for electricity just from a staying cool perspective, staying comfortable, staying safe. More than we've ever experienced before. But as many headlines and maybe the social content, the short form videos that you've scrolled through on your favorite platform shows us, temperature is only part of that equation. There's more to how these costs actually land on your utility bill. So, for this part of the conversation, Tracy Wolf, a former journalist who has covered the intersection of climate and energy. Tracy, I think first, just for those that may not know you, could you start off with a quick introduction about yourself rather, and about how energy is a climate story? And then there's a great set of resources that includes a bunch of data to better report on energy. And that includes new quarterly numbers about how much utility bills are rising for folks and families across the country, right?
Perfect. Yes, I'm going to do all of that. So I am also going to start sharing my screen because it's all part of the presentation, right? Um, Pardon me one quick second. Let's go ahead and click and start. Good. And I'm going to get rid of the closed captioning. Well, thanks, Shell. I really appreciate it. It's so great to be here with you guys. I have sat in on many of these webinars in the past and learned so many great things from Climate Central. So I'm really excited to be here to kind of contribute to this one in a slightly different way. So as we've just heard, we're having to cool our homes a lot more frequently, a lot longer, and it's starting to cost a lot of money. And I'm sure all of you on this call have probably recognized that your bills feel like they're higher than normal, or you're starting to feel the pinch of that monthly utility bill. And so let's talk about why those things are rising. So as Shell said, I'm Tracy Wolf, a former journalist. I was previously the head of the climate unit at CBS News, also did the same thing at ABC News and a couple other places. And what I started finding, especially around this time last year, is that as much as we were reporting on climate stories, we were really starting to report a lot more on energy. And that really became a huge focus of a lot of the work we were doing. And this is part of a broader trend. I was just fairly recently on a panel talking about how energy is the new climate. What we're seeing is a lot of news organizations are turning their climate teams into kind of dual climate and energy units as well. And this isn't just me saying this. This is legitimately something that we're seeing happen. Just as an example, Politico recently revamped its popular E&E newsletter, which had a ton of climate reporting, into a new newsletter that's very focused through the lens of energy. Lisa Friedman, who was one of the main climate policy reporters at the New York Times, she's now a business correspondent covering energy. And Justin Warland, who is the climate reporter over at Time Magazine, they recently revamped his newsletter to call it Future Proof, Making Sense of Energy and the Climate Economy. So it's really impossible to cover the lens of climate without talking about energy. And so this is a big thing that we're seeing. But before we get into all of that, I would love to do a little pop quiz. So nobody needs to raise their hand, but let's just talk about it. I would love to hear from you guys. How much do you believe residential electricity costs have risen nationwide? So just think about that for a second. How much do you think those prices have gone up across the country? 15%, 25%, 40%? Tick, tick, tick. Final answer here, 40%. So 40% since 2021. Residential gas costs have climbed just as fast, and about 40% since, I mean, this is something that's drastically outpacing inflation. So energy costs are going up, your utility bills are going up. This is something that we're seeing across the country. Next, in a recent Ipsos poll for PowerLines, what share of people said that their bill is going up? About half, 50%, about 2 and 3, 68%, or is like nearly everyone? What do you think that is? 2 and 3. So 68% of people in this poll saw their bill increase. So the average monthly utility bill is now $210. And that's up nearly 20% from last year's survey. And actually, 4 and 3 or 77% are concerned that their bills will keep rising. So this is really a big consumer issue that we're seeing right now as well. Okay, so one more little quiz question here for you. How many US customers had their utilities shut off in 2024 alone? About a little more than 2 million, nearly 7 million, or over 13 million. How many people do you think had their utilities shut off? Yes, unfortunately, it is the largest number there. 13.5 million customers had their power shut off in 2024. Nearly 80 million Americans are actually struggling to pay their utility bills today. Oftentimes, they're foregoing food, education, healthcare, other things just to keep the lights on. So let's talk about why these bills are rising. There's a lot of drivers behind rising energy costs. Number one would be demand, right? Like we are electrifying things more so now than we ever have. Not just things like data centers and AI. We've talked a lot recently about electrifying our world, more, electrified vehicles, electrified appliances. Just this general demand for electricity is higher than we've ever experienced. We also have a power grid that is aging. It's really old. It needs drastic updates. This costs money to replace aging infrastructure, things like poles, power lines, transformers. Those costs get passed back to the consumer as power companies and the utility companies are improving that infrastructure. We're also seeing really big fluctuations with natural gas prices, right? And so as those prices fluctuate, that also affects your costs. And then there's also these things called market rules. I don't want to get too much into the weeds, and we have a really, really great speaker coming up, Shereen Phillips. He can talk a little bit more about this. But essentially, the market, we have auctions, and the supply and demand starts impacting the way costs are set, right? And then finally, something that you guys have probably heard a lot here is extreme weather. As we have more wildfires, hurricanes, we see that extreme weather damage infrastructure. You're then having to replace it. And in some cases, you're seeing certain states and cities try to future-proof their infrastructure. Things like California are starting to bury power lines more often to prevent wildfire disaster from impacting those lines. Or, in the Southeast, repairing and bolstering a lot of energy infrastructure from things like hurricanes. Again, it all costs money. Those costs come back to you. So one more quiz question for you. We've talked about how much utility bills are going up, who's feeling the pinch, and why. But who do you actually believe controls your rates, right? So obviously the thought is, okay, the power company controls my rates, or is it the federal government, or are they state regulatory bodies? And the answer is it's a state regulatory body like the Public Utility Commission, commonly called the PUC, or boards of public utilities. And so these are commissions that are generally either appointed by a governor or they are elected by the public. And they review and approve rate increase requests that are made by these utility companies. So in quarter 2 of this past year, utilities requested, as Shell had said at the beginning, $9.2 billion in rate increases that could impact more than 56 million customers. And so far this year, we've already seen utility companies go to some of these regulatory boards and request increases totaling over $18 billion for 2026. Now, if you're wondering how that compares to last year there were 31 billion requests for rate increases, but ultimately about 11.6 billion was approved by these regulatory commissions and boards, impacting 56 million Americans. It's funny because when I've had this conversation with a lot of reporters and just, friends and colleagues, and we start talking about this, most people don't actually know that it's this regulatory board that really decides when and how your rates go up. So 58% of Americans actually don't know what drives their monthly energy bill and who controls it. And so this is why the energy story isn't just a climate story, it's also a political story. Because coming up in this year's midterm elections in November, you're going to have 9 states that will hold elections for their public utility commissions, including Alabama, Arizona, Georgia, Louisiana, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Dakota, and Guam. And 30 states, well, roughly 30 states are holding indirect elections because 29 of those states are having gubernatorial elections where the governor will pick the people that sit on that board. So this is actually an issue where people can do something a little bit about it if they're a little bit more aware of how and why those boards get elected. And this was a huge election story in Georgia last year, where there was a lot of grassroots campaigning because a lot of people were really upset about how expensive their energy bills had gotten in Georgia. There was a ton of work that went into getting people to go out and vote. And they made really significant strides in that particular election, ousting 2 incumbents from the Public Utility Commission and putting in 2 new people who were more in favor of consumer rights. So there's some solutions here, and I want to talk very briefly about that. But really, part number 1 would be making sure that it's just the rate making process is more transparent with public utility commissions and the consumers and advocates so that everyone understands how rates are determined, right? And right now, utility companies are actually, the way they're set up, they're rewarded for capital spending more so than they are for performance and efficiency. So essentially, the more they build, the more they make money. They're not necessarily rewarded for performing better and doing it more efficiently. So there's some things that we can make adjustments there as well. And this kind of goes to my third point here. We want to rein in that construction work in progress cost. Essentially, the minute they start building something, they're going to start passing on those costs to the consumer before it's even operational. So there's another key factor that could be adjusted. And then we really want to make sure that all of those public utility commissions and the consumer advocate offices have the right resources to protect consumers and provide that oversight. And then finally, there are some really great advanced grid enhancing technologies, energy efficiency tools, and other demand side solutions that can make our existing infrastructure work better. So there are things that can be done. I know that these are very kind of big things, but I want you to know that there are ways in which we can change policy and regulation to make it better and hopefully less expensive for the consumer. So if you're wondering where I got all of this data, a lot of it comes from this organization called PowerLines. I met PowerLines when I was a reporter. They're a national energy consumer education nonprofit that aims to lower utility bills and grow the economy. And so the work that they're doing is to really be talking behind the scenes to people that can make some of these decisions, like some of the solutions I just spoke about, so that those solutions can start getting passed more broadly across states and federally so that we can see some of those changes so that we can help protect the consumer. and make those energy bills a little bit less expensive. And so they provide lots of really great resources. As Shell said, they do quarterly reports that shows how often those rates are increasing or how often the rate increases are being requested. They also did a really great report earlier this year on capital expenditures. So when I talked about all of those things that the utility companies are building, they looked at what those costs are, how many projects are in the works. And this is all available on their website. And they will have their next quarterly report coming out on October 8th. And so just as an example, in the most recent Q2 report, here you can see like they've got really good graphics that show you geographically where those rate increase requests are happening. And then you can also then see historically how much more we're seeing now versus we have in the past, right? And then beyond those resources, they also are starting to launch a dashboard that really breaks things down a lot more locally. So here you can see in California, they're going to show you how average energy household bills have changed, what the average utility bill costs at the moment, how much that's gone up. They outline who the Public Utility Commission is, how many there are, whether it's appointed, whether it's elected. They talk about upcoming rates, what's the word I'm looking for? Rate dockets, rate cases. So these are really, really helpful resources. Energy is it's a very challenging topic. And if you're coming into it kind of new and as a novice, which is how I was when I first encountered PowerLines, I just found that their data and their resources were extremely helpful in breaking down this stuff for me, because I think at the end of the day, all reporters love are really good numbers that kind of show these things. And thankfully, PowerLines can kind of be a one-stop shop to find some of these data points. So if you're looking for more additional resources, I would really encourage you to reach out to PowerLines. I can also drop some of this stuff in the chat so you guys can find it directly. There's also really good experts. I've dropped a couple more here at places like Duke University, another excellent organization called Grid Strategies that I've spoken to in the past too, and I've done some reporting and understanding, you know, how and why some of these projects are happening or not happening and their impacts. And then also another really great expert here at Harvard Law School. And so I'm going to stop my share and kick it back to you, Shell. But thank you so much for the opportunity to share all of that with you.
Yeah, always the reporter just giving us all the details that we need and all the experts that you can tag too. I had two questions. One, because I didn't know, I don't think everyone else knew that they were going to get a pop quiz this morning. So I'm going to pop quiz you a little bit too. First thing, sure. I think simple question. You know, you showed some great data as well as some charts from PowerLines. So for everybody that's on the call, maybe thinking about some stories that they can create from this, are those free to use? Like, should they contact PowerLines? Like, how can they go about using that data?
Definitely. So absolutely contact PowerLines. All of their reports are available for you to download directly from their website. I have cited PowerLines in a ton of past reporting. Don't know if you caught it there on my second slide where I talked about me, but that was literally a story where I cited their data. But I think one of the things that was most interesting in my own reporting on energy and climate was about a year ago. I live in the state of New Jersey. Rate increases, utility costs were a really huge part of our gubernatorial election here. And we did a whole story about a couple who had done an insane amount of work to make their home more energy efficient. I mean, they did everything. And they got their power bill and we looked at it and their usage had dropped significantly, like 50%, but their bill still went up. And so this was to show that it didn't even matter if you did all of those right things that you could as a consumer to reduce your energy use. The rates are going up and it wasn't actually going to save you money because, I mean, yes, they were saving money because they were using less electricity, but unfortunately, because the rates were so high, their bill was still really high.
So everyone hold on to that thought, because I have something that personally just landed in my mailbox this week, very similar to that, but we'll kick off Q&A with that. Hold that thought. Last thing before I let you go for a second is the pop quiz for you. You've been in this data, you've worked with PowerLines, so you've really seen these reports. What was most surprising to you? Maybe it was one of the facts that you showed, but like, what was most surprising to you?
I think what's most surprising to me is, okay, let's look at last year. Over $30 billion of rate increases was requested, which just is a mind-blowing number. And I think the thing that I was pleasantly surprised by was at the end of the day, these utility commissions only actually approved, what did I say? Was it like 11 or 13 billion? So I was kind of relieved that, okay, just because the rate increase is requested doesn't mean at the moment that they're automatically being granted. So I think that the whole point of these utility commissions, and I think this is a good segue into talking to Tremaine, is we do have people in place to make sure that these rate requests and the increases aren't going completely unchecked. But I think there's also a tension point here between the regulators and the utility companies understanding we have a bigger demand than we ever have, and we do need to solve for that problem. But how can we solve for it equitably? And I think that's really the biggest challenge going forward. And so I'm actually really curious to hear your conversation with Tremaine, because to me, he was the guy at the place that, had the ability to say yay or nay to some of these things.
Okay, great. Well, then that is a perfect segue. Tracy, appreciate it. Hang out for a bit. We'll
Totally.
get you back in
Thanks.
questions here in a few. Yeah, thank you for that. Okay, so and a reminder, if you do have questions, we have some great ones in the box already, but you can use that Q&A box that we'll get to in just a bit. So I do want to introduce you to Tremaine Phillips, Senior Advisor for PowerLines. He is the president of Third Coast Strategies, LLC. He previously served as a commissioner on the Michigan Public Service Commission, appointed by Governor Gretchen Whitmer, and represented the commission on several state task force addressing poverty, mobility, electrification, and environmental justice. We're not done yet, though. Tremaine previously led the Cincinnati 2030 district as director and served as vice president of strategic initiatives at Empower Saves, where he was named to Midwest Energy News 2016 40 Under 40 list of emerging clean energy leaders. He also held roles with the Prima Civitas Foundation, Michigan's Department of Energy, Labor and Economic Growth, and the Michigan Environmental Council, and interned at the White House Council on Environmental Quality under the Obama administration, working on climate policy, including clean power. Tremaine, buddy, whoa. That's a resume, right? That's a big one. So thanks for, first of all, joining us here today. Really want to, really want to chat and understand, what we've heard so far today and really help put this together so that everyone can tell these stories for their communities. So first, I think kind of tying into what Tracy was just asking about, like how these rate increases are requested. Some are said yes, some are said no to. The first thing that I want to know, though, when my utility bill shows up, when it lands in my mailbox, who's behind the numbers that I'm seeing, which we've kind of gone over a little bit, but if you could get into that, and then who has the power to raise those rates? And in the most simplest form, if you can, how does that process even work?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I will note that is not included on the very long intro of my resume there, I had the full intention in high school of becoming a meteorologist. So I appreciate you allowing me to cosplay as such, maybe for a moment here.
There's still time. You could still
there is
join
still
us.
time.
Yeah.
But your question on who is actually behind the numbers that are reflected in a consumer's utility bill, uh, that ultimately is a question that very few consumers nationwide can answer. And that is a big part of the problem that PowerLines and other consumer education organizations is trying to ultimately solve. PowerLines in its own polling found that 9 in 10 Americans could not name the government body that sets their utility bills. So I want to just kind of explain in the simplest way I can the kind of three sets of actors in this equation and a little bit of the process for how utility decisions are ultimately reflected on consumer utility bills. So the first part of this equation is the regulated gas and electric utilities. So as Tracy has mentioned, in 2026 alone, these companies have requested $18.6 billion dollars in rate increases, and they are collectively planning at least 1.4 trillion in capital expenditures through 2030. Now, these are plans and requests. They are not the actual costs that will land on consumer bills. And proposed spending isn't inherently a bad thing for consumers. As Tracy has mentioned, Our grid is in dire need of replacement, and modernization. We have a grid that is not only aging, but we're demanding more of it, or more from it. And we're also faced with a grid that is increasingly susceptible to extreme weather events and other disruptions. So this spending, some of which is necessary, but when a utility wants to raise rates, they must file what's called a rate case. And this is essentially a formal trial where the utility must justify what it wants to spend, and consumer advocates, businesses, and even individual customers can push back and pressure test whether the utility's plans and their proposed increases are reasonable and prudent. So to emphasize, a regulated utility cannot raise consumer utility bills a single cent without approval from a state regulatory body. And that kind of brings me to that second bucket. So that second bucket are the state energy regulators, state utility regulators, often referred to as public utility commissioners. There are only around 200 public utility commissioners nationwide. I'm a big fan of the NBA, so I often help to ground this number in saying that there are fewer public utility commissioners in America than there are players in the NBA. Yet these roughly 200 state regulators oversee $200 billion on average in utility spending. So think of them as the Supreme Court justices of energy, who on average have jurisdiction over $1 billion of utility spending every year. And these regulators, with the support of their staff, ultimately are responsible with reviewing the reasonableness and prudency of that $1 trillion in projected capital spending between now and 2030. And then the last bucket of actors in this equation are state legislators and governors. Commissioners are often described as creatures of statute. And what that means is that even though commissions and commissioners are independent regulators, they're independent regulatory bodies, they operate within the boundaries, within the rules and processes that are outlined in state statute. So legislatures create those outlines in state statute on how commissions must conduct themselves in these proceedings. Legislatures also hold the purse strings. They determine how much in funding, staffing, resources that public utility commissions have in order to properly scrutinize these massive utility requests. And then finally, governors and legislators also play an even more direct role. In the vast majority of states, governors directly appoint commissioners. And in those states, the legislatures often have to approve those appointments by their respective governors in those states. So that kind of gives you a sense for not only the process, but who are the main drivers that ultimately lead to the impacts on consumer utility bills.
Uh, I'm in Texas, so I knew ERCOT, and I think everybody knew ERCOT. But then February 2021 came, and then I think everybody all of a sudden knew the Utility Commission as well. So I think that's maybe my question. You said you can't raise rates without the PUCs and legislate. How does one person's voice that is actually consuming this energy, how do they get into that conversation? Like, where do they fit into the piece of like the feedback of these funds being asked to be increased?
Yeah, well, what is at least promising here is that rising utility bills are not inevitable. That this is really more of a policy outcome more than anything, and that ultimately our energy regulatory framework was meant to be one in which consumers were at the center of that process. and consumers have been left behind at some point along the way. And so, what we have seen through polling at PowerLines is that consumers are ready and willing to be re-engaged. 76% of consumers want stronger utility oversight at the state level. And we need to go about that by modernizing our grid, as I mentioned before, which is going to take some investment. But the only way that we can do so affordably, that we can do so with the confidence of consumers and voters, is to advance policies that create a more transparent, a more accountable, better resource commissions, and that provide real avenues for consumer participation in these decisions. Fundamentally, what PowerLines is centrally focused on is that we need to put consumers back at the center of the energy regulatory framework. And there are many ways in which consumers can go about doing that. The most formal way could be participating and intervening in a rate case. There are informal ways in terms of participating in public hearings, are being able to submit testimony in some of these dockets, submit even just comments in some of the dockets that are proceeding over these rate cases, or other similar proceedings. But I think the most important thing that we have to do is we have to educate consumers and voters, make them aware of who actually has control over these decisions, and then provide the pathways for their voices to be heard within this energy regulatory framework.
Okay, and maybe just to pinwheel off that, that's a great segue to my next question, which was, we know that rising temperatures, at least for right now, aren't going anywhere. We understand that our cities are getting hotter. We also understand, as Tracy mentioned, as Jen mentioned, as you've mentioned, the demand for electricity is going up. So, what are some of the real? We've talked about modernization a couple times here, but what are some of the real solutions? I guess really for both of these things.
Yes, I'll offer one concrete solution, and Tracy had mentioned it before, but we need state level policies and where amenable federal policies as well that encourage, if not require, regulated utilities to more efficiently use the grid that consumers have already paid for. Our grid is the largest machine in the world. It's frankly unheralded achievement of American innovation, but on average, it runs at 50% utilization. And what I mean by that is we built this enormous, expensive machine, and we only use half of the capacity that it was built for. Getting more juice out of the existing grid through technologies that, what the industry calls grid enhancing technologies, or demand flexibility, or shifting usage to lower cost hours of the day. All of this will allow utilities to bring more load onto the system, which allows then utilities to spread more of the fixed cost of operating and maintaining the grid over more consumer usage, and ultimately lower utility bills for all consumers. And we can do that while reducing the need for more costly new generation and transmission infrastructure as well.
Great. Okay. And then just very briefly, so we can get to some of these questions that are in the box. But I think one thing I really want to know from you, we've got a lot of folks that are watching today. They're going to be able to tell these stories for their viewers, for their followers, who a lot of which, as they watch those, will have very strong feelings about their bills because nobody likes to spend more money when they don't have to. So I think, what's the most important message that we could tell as we're telling these stories about, how this all comes together?
Yeah, I think the most important message that we want to communicate to consumers and to voters is that over the next several months, this is just an incredibly important, maybe a once in a generation opportunity to really be able to have productive, positive change in terms of reforming the energy regulatory process, the energy regulatory framework. Which ultimately many of the issues that are leading to utility bill increases for consumers are just a symptom of a regulatory framework that is outdated, that is not dynamic to keep pace with the demands and changes on the grid today. So, we have 36 state governor offices that are up for election this fall, countless state legislators that are up for election in the states where commissioners are elected. Those are going to be important opportunities as well. But regardless of politics, our party, we need decision makers who are willing to make energy affordability, utility affordability, a top three concern for them and have an agenda, an action plan for how to lower consumer utility bills on day one of stepping into office.
All right, Tremaine Phillips, I appreciate your insight. Stay here, Tracy, Jen, if you'd pop back on. And then I think, Tremaine, just to get into our questions from everybody in attendance, we'll start here because we knew this would be a question that would be asked. This is probably not the very first time you've been asked this question, nor will it be close to the last time. AI data centers, right? Like this is one of the things that we understand, like there's a lot of growth of, and this is one of the reasons. So the question from Lori is, what are the effects on the grid and utility commissions of AI data center? And then how do commissions manage that growth? And do they manage that growth?
Well, it certainly depends on which commission that one wants to cite or refer to. And every state legislature, governor's office, and public utility commission across the country are trying to find their own path for handling their increased load and demands on the system from hyperscaler facilities, as well as other sources of demand and capacity constraints on the system. Again, what we want to emphasize is that the impacts of data centers are a symptom of this outdated, inflexible regulatory framework and construct. That whether it's data centers or the onshoring of manufacturing or electrification, all of these have put strains on the system, and we need a more dynamic, flexible regulatory framework in order to deal with impacts on our grid today, as well as looking towards the impacts of new sources of load or demand that could arrive, in the next decade. So there are many different pathways that states are taking right now. PowerLines, we're continuing to outline for decision makers and policymakers what some of those ideal regulatory and legislative steps could be and to best address and keep consumers at kind of the centerpiece of this data center question and where it intersects and has a nexus with the impacts on the electricity grid. But again, we don't want to over-index on the data center issue when ultimately the underlying issue is the energy regulatory construct in this country and at the state level.
Thanks. Okay, so I want to bring a question back. Jen kind of tackled this a little bit in the Q&A box, but maybe start with you, Tracy, and then Jen, you can come in to talk about it as well. A great question from Celia, where we're talking about how do we tell the story to our viewers. So the general basis here is like, you don't have a lot of time in a newscast to talk about everything you want to talk about. So how do we phrase this in newscast to stay under 1 minute? There may not be space to define cooling degree days. So is there a way to simplify in staying accurate? Is it accurate to say the need for air conditioning to keep indoor temperatures comfortable has gone up nearly 100% in Boise, Idaho, for example? Like, how do we tell the story in the tight confines of maybe a VOSOT or a reader or a package?
I was hoping Jen was going to answer that, but it's funny you bring that question up because this was kind of my job when I worked at the networks. It was how do we get all of this information in such a short amount of time? I think, Shell, you actually answered your own question because we just did it there.
Yeah.
Um, but
Well,
essentially,
Celia
yes.
answered her own question maybe because I
Yeah.
was
I
just reading
mean,
her stuff. Yeah.
essentially it's just that we're seeing that there's X number of date, like depending on where you're based, it's you know here in New York City, we're seeing that we have to turn our air conditioners on so many, this many more days each year in order to keep ourselves comfortable. That's costing us more money. I think what I have really found works, especially from a reporter perspective, is always try to frame it in the minds of your audience, which are consumers, right? So keeping it really, really friendly. Maybe not going so. Not that I've never been a huge fan of math. Don't hate me, Jen. It's just not been my friend. But rather than getting into the nitty gritty of the
Oh
math,
yeah.
just put it in the terms that your audience will really understand. And then to the point that we've made, there's data out there to show you, okay, your utility bills have gone up this percent. The average utility bill is now this price in your state. And so I think again, bringing it back to those broad numbers, to keep it really simple, you can still keep it short and tight.
Yeah, and the only thing I had to add, and this is putting on my data analyst hat, if you have a few extra seconds, if you can just say this is because of our increasing average temperatures, because that actually does kind of get to the math without doing the math. And it's maybe very obvious, but you're just kind of reinforcing what this measure is based on. So again, I think that would be a little few bonus points if you can slip that in. This is based on the increasing average temperatures, because that's really what it is a measure of.
Yeah. And I really like bringing these two topics together. Like they make sense together inherently. But I remember there are times when I try to talk about cooling degree days with my news director and he got that like news director eyes glaze over. And I had to like figure out, he was like, just put it in weathercast. Like that's it. So this is a good place to get it into the newscast and out of the
I
weathercast
will
too.
say, Shell, I have seen now, and I'm really surprised by this, like weather sections on websites and in the newspaper, where they actually list the number of cooling degree days, which kind of shocked me that that is like a measure that's being shared now because it can be somewhat complex to explain.
Yeah. I mean, it's easy to get into because we understand like a lot of us are running our air conditioner more. Okay. So we have time for one last question before we get out of here on time. So maybe Jen, if you could just answer this as easily as you can. How do we determine this is from Christine? How do we determine a normal average temperature in a world that isn't normal or average anymore compared to maybe what some of us have known? It's a question we get
I
a lot.
invite you to also speak up, Shell, if you want to talk about that. Um, I think that's a good question. And a lot of times I'll talk about the shifting baseline because I think sometimes it is important to acknowledge that we're living in a different world. And so a lot of times that's what I'll talk about. And again, to kind of um, hopefully what I've learned from people like Tracy, or I talk about like when I was growing up, this is where the averages were, and now the averages are here. And so to just really explicitly not acknowledge that the baseline is different, that we're living in a different world. And I don't even think you necessarily have to put numbers on it, but we have research has found also that we don't have a really long memory. Like I may remember playing outside as a kid, but technically we only remember a few years or so. And so we actually adjust mentally to this new normal, which is also impacting how we react to it because we're like, oh, this is how it is. And we don't think of that only 10, 15, 20 years ago, it was quite different. So there's a lot going on in our human brains, kind of trying to absorb the change. So I don't know if you have any thoughts, Shell, as a meteorologist.
Yeah, I mean, climate shift index is really helpful because it is one of those moments where you say like, well, yeah, it is August. It's supposed to be hot in August, but like not this hot. And we understand this is becoming more likely. But I think really my most successful is one of my favorite. I'm not just saying this because I'm with Climate Central now, but like when I was on TV, there was a great Shifting Cities. We just kind of re-released that. So it kind of showed where summer is headed for, what your summer is going to feel like. So for me, being in Texas, our summer is actually shifting to a climate that's more like Eastern Africa, right? So like just understanding how the climate is shifting, connecting this like what you remember versus what you're experiencing now. And there was a question earlier in the box just about like, what's the time of our places in winter? A lot of our locations are getting warmer. So it's really helping you understand like, did you used to go to a pumpkin patch when you had to bundle up and put on a scarf and get to wear your boots with the fur and like do all the Instagrammy things that you did? Or are you going to a pumpkin patch now and getting bit by mosquitoes and you're in shorts and a t-shirt, right? So like helping connect those moments of life and the things you remember from childhood and things you want to carry to your family's children, your children. I think that's anytime we can make those connections, it's really helpful. And again, what we've talked about here today with air conditioning use and cooling. Okay. We are at time. So I want to say thank you to Tracy, to Jen, to Tremaine. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Thank you for everybody who has popped on here to join us. Again, following up shortly after we wrap up here today, we'll send out the recording, links, and resources by email. A reminder, if you haven't already, you can sign up for Climate Matters, our weekly reporting package that arrives in your inbox every Wednesday morning, ready to use data, visuals, scientific summaries, and other resources on timely climate-related topics, all of which are 100% free for your storytelling and your reporting. And then reach out if you have any other questions about the data, the tools, or anything, how to apply this information in your storytelling. When we wrap up, a short survey will pop up. A lot of us hit X on it. I've done it myself. But really what we want to know, it is very short. We want to be able to make sure that these future webinars are topics that you care about and that you want to know more about so that you can use them in your reporting. So if you have a second, please fill that out. And with that, I'll just say thank you again for joining us today. We hope your day is a 72-degree one and a breezy one, and we will see you back here on the next one. Thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of your Wednesday.